A young mom who had dreams of becoming a nurse. A joyful 2-year-old boy. Both found dead, stabbed to death in a Connecticut apartment. The man accused of this horrific crime, the child's own father. Police say the 26-year-old man tried to make a run for it, allegedly leaping from a second-story window in a last-ditch effort to escape. But his alleged plan failed. Neighbors reportedly had already called 911 after hearing screams from the apartment. When the officers arrived, they found a gruesome scene. I'll walk you through this story. For Law&Crime News, I'm Kennedi Walker. 26-year-old Jevon Fletcher is behind bars, accused of a crime so brutal it's hard to comprehend. The stabbing deaths of his girlfriend, Hailey Miller, and his son, Fletcher. At this time, police have not released a possible motive, so we don't know why Jevon allegedly killed them. What we do know is both of them leave behind grieving family members. Baby Tanaj was just 2 years old. A GoFundMe page described the toddler as a bright light full of laughter, energy, and an infectious joy that could lift anyone's spirits. Hailey was 19 years old. She's not Tanaj's mother, but does leave behind a child of her own. Her family told WFSB News that she wanted to be a nurse and was dedicated to giving her son the best life possible. She had just moved into her own apartment, excited for a fresh start. But instead of building a new life there, it became the place where hers came to a tragic end. According to West Haven police, on February 15th around 8:50 p.m., dispatch received multiple 911 calls reporting screams and cries for help coming from Hailey's apartment. Moments later, callers allegedly reported seeing a man, later identified as Jevon Fletcher, hurl himself through a second-floor glass window, landing on the walkway. By the time officers arrived, Fletcher was on the ground, injured. But inside, they found a scene far more disturbing. Police say they found Hailey and a 2-year-old boy, identified by family as Tanaj, dead. Both reportedly suffered multiple stab wounds. Fletcher was taken to a hospital for treatment after injuring himself from the fall. He was later arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of murder with special circumstances, and 1 count of risk of injury. And here to discuss this with me is trauma specialist and therapist Sherry Botwin. Sherry, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just dive right in. The suspect, Jevon Fletcher, is accused of allegedly killing 2 people, including his 2-year-old son. Can you just explain what makes a person kill, let alone kill their own child?
In this situation, it sounds like this is a person who has so much pent-up anger and rage. There has to be a backstory with him. There has to be some type of trauma or violence, or even just the way that he thinks. You know, one of the questions that I have when I hear about these type of crimes is this a person who is mentally unwell, or is this a person who's just so angry and has pathology that he doesn't really have any respect or concern about other people, and the fact that these are actually human beings, that he's taking human beings away from people that love them, and supposedly he loved them too.
And in your experience, just the victims' families, how do you think the child's mother, Tanaj's mom, processes something just so horrific?
I think in a story like this, I don't think there's a lot of processing that happens until time goes by. When a family member experiences this type of tragic loss, there's usually a lot of shock and disbelief. And it can take weeks or even months to actually really let yourself know the reality of what just happened.
And Jevon Fletcher, he is accused of stabbing both victims. From just a psychological perspective, what does using a knife in a crime like this say about the suspect's state of mind?
What it says to me is this is a person who is acting in a fit of rage with someone he's very close to. When someone uses a firearm, there's usually a level of distance between the person committing the crime and the person that's getting hurt. When a criminal or someone who commits this type of homicide is using a knife, it's almost like another way to help us understand this was an intimate partner situation. He killed his partner, and he did it in a way that was very violent and very close. There was no way that she was going to be able to escape that.
Right. And this is all, alleged. He is accused of these crimes. Are there any common psychological traits or disorders seen in parents who commit homicide?
The ones that commit homicide, when they go through the psychological testing, what they will find if there is a mental health issue is that most of the people who commit these crimes are being diagnosed with things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression. We don't know yet with this alleged criminal what the issue is, what the psychological tests are going to show us. But in most situations, when there's a mental health disorder, it's a severe disorder that is incapacitating the person, and the disorder is creating some awful thoughts. In this case, and again, we don't know this yet, but in cases like this, what we could find out is that part of his symptomology might have been homicidal ideation, homicidal urges.
When a suspect is arrested for a crime like this, do they typically show remorse in these types of cases, or is there a psychological detachment?
There's such a level of detachment, and I think that's part of what draws people to these type of stories, because I think as human beings, we're trying to figure out how can you do something like that and then show no remorse, take no accountability. From what I'm seeing so far, I'm not seeing any remorse or accountability. It's almost like he's not even in his body. When I watched him he was talking to the judge the other day, and what I saw was a man that was sitting there that looked almost like null and void, just vacant of any emotions.
What kind of psychological evaluation would Jevon likely, undergo before trial?
There's going to be a whole bunch of psychological testing that he would need to go through. The psychologist is going to look to see, is there any type of undiagnosed mental health disorder? They're going to look at things like what was behind the crime. Was there a reason? Had they gotten in a fight? Did he find something out that really made him mad? Was he having hallucinations? Was he having delusions? They're going to probably do a pretty in-depth look at his history. What kind of childhood did he have? Was there any violence that he witnessed growing up? So basically, what they're going to do is they're going to interview him, and they're going to do a whole bunch of testing to look at his background, the relationship that he had with her and the kids, just to try to figure out what actually happened that caused him to snap and allegedly commit such a horrible crime.
If mental illness is a factor, how does that play into legal defenses?
I mean, in some cases, we see this with defense attorneys. If they find that there's a mental unwellness, something like schizophrenia, what will happen is the defense lawyers may then say, we are going to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. So I think we're early in the case. We don't really know how this part of the case will unfold. What I see sometimes in these types of cases is that defendants will try and use things like temporary insanity because they don't want to have to deal with the consequences that could happen if this was actually a person who just committed a murder.
Are there psychological distinctions between someone who pleads insanity and someone who knowingly commits a crime like this?
I mean, there's a lot of distinctions when somebody's having a mental health crisis or a mental health breakdown, and if they're reporting things like they were hearing voices, or they were having thoughts of doing this, or they don't remember after what made them do this. We're going to find out what the intent was. Was their intent, or did he just sort of snap in the moment? We'll find out, was he hearing voices, or was he just so full of rage that that was the action that he chose to take in the moment? So as the case unfolds, I think we're going to find out a lot more about that. And there's a lot of cases right now that we're hearing about that have similar themes, especially when it comes to intimate partner violence. In these types of cases, there are times when the defendants will have true mental health disorders that will cause them to act in such a way. But then there's other times when we find out that this was a situation where there was domestic violence, and the situation can escalate to the point where somebody ends up getting killed. And that's the unfortunate reality when we're dealing with domestic violence.
Well, let's talk more about that and just dig a little bit deeper. How do officials just differentiate between a suspect who was mentally unwell and one who just acted simply out of rage?
I think, again, that goes back to the psychological evaluations and the testing. Psychologists have different scales that they can use and different questions that they can ask where they can really assess for what were the circumstances, what was happening right before the crime allegedly happened, what was happening that week, the month before. With appropriate testing and conversations, I think they'll be able to figure out if this is a person who just on a whim acted on a terrible impulse and just lost it, or if he is someone that has a mental health disorder that was maybe not being treated, and unfortunately then she becomes the victim or he becomes the person that perpetrates this type of crime. We'll find out. We don't know yet, but I think that's one of the things that's important in cases of domestic violence, is really, really doing some integral or in-depth interviews with the perpetrator or the alleged criminal, because that's how you find out. He on his own will not be able to explain what happened, what caused him to act in this way. That's why it's important that they have forensic psychologists and psychiatrists to really sit down with these defendants so that they can find more out.
So, what role does impulse control or lack thereof play in crimes like this?
I think the lack of impulse control is what puts people in these types of situations in so much more danger. Clearly, in this situation, it seems as though something must have happened and the alleged perpetrator snapped, and he wasn't able to maybe even identify that he was having the urge to be so violent. But it's very dangerous, especially in situations where there is any type of domestic violence.
What kind of trauma do the victim's loved ones experience in cases like this?
The trauma is, it's profound. I mean, this just happened a few days ago. So what I imagine for the loved ones is that they're in a state of shock and disbelief, trying to comprehend and process such a devastating loss. Our brains are not equipped to process something like that in a day or even in a week. So, what I'm imagining for the family members is they're experiencing a whole host of emotions, and that could be anywhere from rage to disbelief to deep grief. I think this is a situation where their lives are going to be changed forever.
Hailey Miller had another young child. What psychological impact could this have on her son as he grows up?
I mean, again, he's going to grow up without his mom. So he's so young that there's nothing for him to even understand at this point. I think at 3, he'll start to realize that his mom is missing. In my experience, I know that when kids are really little and they lose a parent, it can take a while for them to realize just how much they really miss and want that person back in their life. I hope that he'll have some memories of her as he gets older. This little guy is going to need a lot of love and support, and he's going to grow up without his mom.
Can we talk more about that support? Like, if you were his family, like, what do you recommend his family does to help him just grieve and cope with this loss?
The most important thing is that he knows that he's loved, that he knows that even without his mom, there's people in his family that will look after him, that will take care of him, that will have his back. So I think for family members, any gestures that involve reaching out, showing support, taking care of. I don't know where he is right now, but I'm hoping that over the course of the next several years, really, while he's going through his childhood, that he feels like he's getting some of what he won't be able to get from his mom, the nurturing, the caring, the love. So the best thing family members can do in a situation like this is just be present and continue to show up for this little guy, because he's going to need it.
Do you recommend some type of therapy at this young age, or do you recommend that for older children?
I think because he's so young, what might be best is to just sort of give some time, a little bit of time to see if there's any behavior changes, if there's regressing behaviors, sleep problems, probably pretty soon, maybe when he's 4 or 5, if he was able to go to a therapist that could do play therapy or some form of art therapy. When kids are that little, they don't have the ability to talk and express themselves, they don't have the words. But I do think it's going to be very important that he get some psychological support. And again, maybe not right now, but pretty soon, by the time he's 4 or 5, it would be great if the family got him psychological support so that he can begin to wrap his head around all this.
Yeah, that's some great advice. Now, this was an alleged domestic situation. How often do intimate relationships escalate into extreme violence?
I mean, sadly, what the statistics are telling us is over 70% of situations where there's intimate partner violence, the situation will escalate. And from what I'm reading, over 4,000 women in our country alone die and they lose their life as a result of their partner committing homicide. So it's a really, really serious problem that we really need to continue to talk about.
For those that are watching and they may unfortunately be going through some type of domestic situation, what are some red flags that could indicate a relationship might turn deadly?
Yeah, I think the things to pay attention to if you're in a relationship with someone that is controlling of your time, tries to take over finances in a way that's controlling, if your partner is unreasonably jealous in situations that aren't appropriate to feel that way, if your partner is abusing alcohol or drugs and has a history of violence. There's also sometimes in situations like this, there's stalking behavior. So if you're in a relationship where you can't even go out and be with your friends without your partner tracking you or showing up at locations where you are, there's so many signs. I mean, oftentimes when you're in a relationship like this, the signs don't show up in the beginning. Often in the beginning, there's a lot of what we call love bombing, and the relationship seems to be going so well. But if you're starting to feel like something doesn't feel right, if you start to feel like you're unsafe, and that's the most important thing to think about. If you feel unsafe physically, sexually, emotionally, those are flags that you may be in a relationship that is involving some type of domestic violence.
In cases like this, where the victim, Hailey, was allegedly screaming and most likely
Mhm.
trying to escape, what does that suggest about the person, the suspect's mental state?
If the person is screaming and the alleged perpetrator is continuing to commit such a horrible crime, what I'm thinking is that he wasn't really present. He was so in his rage that I don't think he could see what he was actually doing. And that's part of what's so upsetting about these types of situations. She was clearly fighting for her life and wanted somebody to come to her rescue. And again, this is stuff we'll find out, I know, as the case unfolds, but that didn't snap him out of his rage. He just continued to harm her, and ultimately, she lost her life.
Does a crime of this nature typically indicate premeditation, or can it be just an act of sudden rage?
From what I know, when someone uses a knife, there's not usually as much premeditating that goes into that. That can be more of a spontaneous, impulsive type of situation. I don't know if he was premeditating, thinking about, but from everything that I'm hearing about this particular case, it sounds like something must have happened in that moment before he decided to grab the knife, and he just went on a tyrant and really just acted in awful ways, allegedly.
Right, right. Yeah, all of this is alleged. What can be done on a larger scale, whether through mental health resources or intervention programs to prevent domestic violence from escalating into murder?
I mean, the one thing that I'm thinking as we're sitting here is just even having segments like this where we're actually talking openly about domestic violence. There needs to be more education. There needs to be community outreach. And I think especially for people in relationships where there's young children, the parents are young, just being able to let people know what are the warning signs and what can you do? Because a lot of times when people are being abused by a partner, they don't actually know what they're supposed to do. You can go to therapy and that's great, but I think the most important thing to do in domestic violence situations is figure out how to set up a plan and get yourself out of there. Because I think you have to consider that if you're with someone who's potentially violent or dangerous, you don't want to just get in that person's face or tell that person that you're about to leave. You want to make sure that you tell people first, that you have a plan. And I think if we continue to talk about things like domestic violence, even starting with kids in middle school and all through the rest of kids' lives and adults in the community, we would see that the statistics could possibly be a little bit less.
Right. I'm hoping that, this advice saves at least one life. Thank you so much, Sherry. We definitely appreciate it.
Thank you.
Jevon Fletcher is being held on a $3 million bond. According to WFSB, Fletcher is due back in court next month for a probable cause hearing, and in the meantime is not allowed to communicate with the victims' families. He is allegedly now on suicide watch. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.